Well, tonight I wanted to look at the subject of greed, and really the genesis of this was my meditations and my getting ready for Sunday's sermon, and I had a whole section on Judas and his motivations and activities leading up to his betrayal of Christ. And so I'd like you to turn to John chapter 12, and we'll look at that briefly. But I want to begin with a statement. I've given you some lines on your outline that you can write this down if you'd like, or I know people learn in different ways from writing a lot or not, and so if you want to take a picture of it or if you want me to send it to you, I can, but you can write it down. But the statement I'd like to begin with is this: the desire for riches and wealth is fertile soil for all sorts of destructive temptations, and seeking to satisfy this desire is a root of all sorts of evil. I'll leave that up there for a little bit here, Noah, and we can bring it down when I tell you. But this is obviously evidently you'll see, I think, a paraphrase of 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10, which speaks about the love of money as the root of all sorts of evil. And in my summary of this, in my rephrasing of this, I use the word seeking to satisfy. Because oftentimes I think we think of love as this emotion or this, again, just a feeling, as opposed to something. If we love something, we serve it. If we love something, we seek after it. And so when Paul, I believe, writes about the love of money, it's not this fluttery feeling of dollar bills, although some people may indeed have that, I don't know. It is this seeking to satisfy, or seeking in that satisfaction. So looking at this issue of greed here, and I wanted to look at the story of Judas, and I want to read verses 1 through 8 of John chapter 12. And I will have a time of, I'd like some interaction, some answering questions, some answers, so be ready for that in the middle here. But I want to look at a couple things first. Starting in John 12, verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." A couple of things here. We can look at this. If you look at verse 4, it says Judas was intending to betray him. I mentioned on Sunday that it wasn't until this setting, right before the triumphal entry, really, the Lord's Supper and the triumphal entry, that whole last week of Jesus' ministry, that the issue of a betrayal from one of the number of the disciples, or any betrayal, was even brought up. But John, in his hindsight and under the inspiration of the Spirit, notes that Judas was intending, and he also says that Judas used to pilfer from the money box. in verse 6. So there was this habit formed that Judas used to skim off the top, take some of the money that he was going to distribute, and maybe whatever he did with it, however he spent it, whatever he did, we're not necessarily told that, but he used to steal from it. And I think one of the important things to note is that his activity prior to this point was to do that. It wasn't known by the disciples. Necessarily wasn't mentioned. He didn't stick out as the one who would be the most conniving or wicked of the 12. And after this time when Mary opened up this bottle of perfume and started anointing it with Jesus with it, he's not even allowed to sell the remainder of it. Jesus says, let her keep it for the day of my burial. So they're keeping the remainder. And it's after this, you look at, we won't turn there, but in Matthew and Mark, Matthew 26, after this is when Judas then goes and seeks out the Pharisee or the scribes and the leaders to say, what will you give me to betray him to you? So Judas, in his process of actively giving into his greed, would pilfer the money box. And even though his objections publicly sounded pious, hey, we could sell this for the poor here, his underlying motivation was Judas needs a new pair of shoes or something. And ultimately, this was the groundwork for at least Judas' own motivation for willingly doing that which he was prophesied to do, that which from the outset made him the son of perdition that Jesus speaks of, the one prophesied who would betray him. So it's important to look at Judas' story as a cautionary tale for the need to be mindful of. And on Sunday I mentioned the reality that greed, or any sin in general, but it's one of those things that's always around us. Or at least the call for greed, the siren song that would be responded to by us in greed. It's always around us that we need to be careful for and have mastery over. So I want to look at this issue of greed and particularly the love of money. So we can turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 6, the passage that we looked at or that I referenced for this first statement. I'm going to go ahead and begin reading, starting in verse 6, if you can follow along. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. So greed, this love of money, this insatiable quest for more, Paul gives an instruction to Timothy to be on guard against us, to flee that. A couple things about this, just noting here, and you see it really in Paul's urging to Timothy here, but in letter A under your number 3 there, it's a particular prohibition for elders. It's mentioned here that Timothy is to do that, but if you look back at chapter 3, in the first several verses, you have the qualifications for elders in the church. One of the things, as a characteristic of those who are elders, is they're to be free from the love of money. In addition to all those other good character qualities, an overseer must then be free from the love of money. And again, I think when we think about love, it's properly manifested in that service, in that striving after. And really, if we put that together with what Paul says in chapter 6, fleeing from that, not just those temptations, but being aware of and striving to be free from that love of money that seeks to be served, and often by and through those various temptations. But it's not just a thing that elders, those who seek to be elders, need to watch out for. Turn over to Luke chapter 12. I'd like a volunteer to read for me verses 13 through 15. Luke 12, 13 through 15. I'm going to ask ask us then to talk about why I've included this verse in the subject regarding greed. You want to read that for Rachel? Thank you. Luke 12, 13 through 15.
Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over him?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions."
Okay, so question I have is why would these verses be included in this general discussion of the problem of greed? How does this fit into that category? Coveting is connected to greed, for sure. Okay. Anybody else? Is this a situation that most of us will never be in, or a situation that many of us might be in? Hey, can you tell him how to divide the inheritance, please? Can we get this set up here? On various levels, not in the same cultural context, for sure. But the reality of dividing up inheritance or those kinds of things can be an opportunity for this covetousness, this greediness, this untoward desire for that which is not ours, we don't have, or that we feel entitled to for some reason, in which it can manifest. And so really it's a problem for all of us to watch out for. That's the letter B there. I think it's a problem that we all need to be aware of, and to be careful that even in common situations, we have to be careful that greed, or this desire for those things we don't have, this covetousness, doesn't control or act as a controlling mechanism in our actions. You can, of course, want proper division of property in a way that's not greedy or covetous. That's very true. But we have to be very careful I'll never forget a story I was told of, well, let's just say, the desire to take the things of those who have passed in the most difficult and uncouth timing is a thing that happens very often because they want what's theirs, or what they think they should have. Greed, this desire for things, money, possessions, whatever it might be, is a problem we all have to be careful of. And really, and we ought to, so letter B is really, it comes in normal life, and letter C is really an extension of that. We have to, again, I'd say watch out for Ephesians chapter 5, verse 3 speaks to this issue. And if you notice there, Ephesians 5:3 and Colossians 3:5, I'm going to remember that probably from this week's study, going forward, those two palindromy-like references relating to the subject of greed. Verse 3 of Ephesians chapter 5, but immorality or any impurity or greed must not even be named among you as is proper among the saints. Now, if you read that verse, immorality, impurity, and greed, just on a basic kind of level, two sound a lot worse than the third. Just kind of in immorality, impurity, they have a more detestable sound to my ears, my sinful ears, than greed does. But these all are not proper, not to be named among the saints. We are to be a people who strive to not be characterized or known for this greed. And part of the reason is Colossians 3, verse 5, Paul says, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desires, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. Because ultimately one of the reasons why, or the problems with greed, is it is this idolizing, this improper elevation of money or the possessions above where they ought to be, to the place that only God should possess. I'd like two volunteers, one to read Ecclesiastes 5:10 and one to read Proverbs 27:20 when it comes to the reality of loving money. I have two volunteers to read one Ecclesiastes 5 and the other to read Proverbs 27. I'm gonna volunteer someone here, I think. All right, Rachel, I saw your hand go up. So, and then Noah. I didn't have to volunteer anybody. They had volunteers. So, Rachel, would you read Ecclesiastes 5:10, and Noah Proverbs 27:20, and these two verses are going to be related to the reality of, like, the end result, the kind of at the end of the line. If you win the game of loving money, what's that end result? And so, Rachel, would you please read Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10?
He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity.
Okay. And Noah, would you read Proverbs 27, verse 20?
Feel and have done are never satisfied, nor the eyes of man have satisfied.
So, the reality is, there is no satisfaction, there is no winning the game when it comes to having enough if the love of money is that principle. It never satisfies. It's vanity. And it's easy to say that. Hopefully it is easy to say that. And it's important for us to know that, but the question, you can go ahead and take the statement down now. We'll have another one come up in a minute here. But I want to ask a question. So we've looked at, obviously, a case study of Judas. his greed in time was stealing over time that eventually set the stage for him to betray Jesus for money, even though he felt bad and threw all the money back. I wonder if you've ever felt that before when you get the sin, when you do the sin that you've been looking for, you realize it is ashes. Well, Judas, in his unbelief, found that to be unsatisfying. So the question that I have for us right now is, what are some of the motivations that you can think of that essentially manifest in greed, in a desire for wealth, and a desire for money? What are some of those things that either, the siren song of temptation or whatever it might be, what are those things that then can result in greediness, in this desire and love of money? Any thoughts? What's one reason why someone might want a lot of money? Stephanie. Bigger and better things. Okay? Perceived security. Okay? Easy life. Yeah. Very good. Anybody else? Noah? Influential, power, authority. They want to be able to have their say and do what they want to do. Okay? There might be an altruistic. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. We mentioned idolatry, which is a common one that was in one of the verses we read. Is this, if you can look to the God of money to satisfy, to provide, to do, to deliver all those things? Any others? You guys pretty much hit the ones that I had written down. Power and authority. How does money give you authority or power? You can have influence, give money to people to do what you want them to do. Spread the money around to political campaigns, to whatever else, to whatever it might be. You can have a lot of influence. Because I think, when I was younger, I thought, well, who loves dollar bills? Right? But it's never about never. It's probably very rarely about the actual glinting of the gold, like Scrooge McDuck in the money bin. That was we watched DuckTales when I was a kid. At least I did. Greed isn't generally like that, of wanting to take a money bath or something like that. It's about what the money can do, what it can buy for you. And one of those that a couple of you mentioned was an easy life, or the stuff, or for pleasures. You can have more comfort. Why do I want a lot more? Because I like AC 24/7, or whatever. I like to be in a climate controlled environment all the time, or whatever else. Who knows? A couple of you mentioned perceived security. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 13. This one I think is helpful because of this. The way that the author of the Hebrews talks about this. Look at starting in verse 5, and I'll read verse 6 as well, in Hebrews 13. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So that we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? The connection of this love of money is related to the provision or the fear of a lack of provision, or what men might do to assail you if you don't have enough to go around. So it's a desire for providing security, just economically, but also being oppressed. So the fear of man and the fear of the unknown and the fear of the inevitability of life can all lead to this love of money to give a false sense of security, of deliverance, of provision. So here's another question. If greed were a sickness, what is some of the prescribed antidotes and remedies to greed? Think about in the Bible some of the things we've read, maybe things we haven't read yet. If greed is a sickness, if it is an illness, just think about it in medical terms. We were the doctor yesterday, so I'm thinking of medical stuff. What would be the prescription? Okay, take 2 of these and call me tomorrow. What would be the prescription? Do this kind of physical therapy, whatever it might be. What would be the prescriptions? Contentment. Okay? Anything else? Noah. Okay. Jesus challenged the man who loved his things to show that he loves God first, more than his wealth, which, as Matthew 7 and other places speak about loving one master. You only have one master. You can't serve both God and wealth, which is exactly what Jesus was trying to, was what he was explaining to the rich young ruler, because you don't go to heaven by selling all of your possessions or by giving money to charity, no matter who you are. But it was to show, to illustrate that man's idol was, or his God was not God, it was his stuff. So focusing on serving one master. One might say seeking first the kingdom of God. Then contentment, focusing on the fact that we need to serve Christ above all else. He should be the single primary recipient of our love and attention, who we look to for all those things, and seeking first what he has commanded and prescribed. So principles to battle greed. Number 1, strive to love Jesus more than anything else. Or you can say strive to love Jesus first. Matthew 10:37, he who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. We're not to hate as in like actively despise other people, but our love for Jesus, our service and seeking after him ought to dwarf properly our seeking after love of other people. Or Matthew 6:24, also what we referenced with, no one can serve 2 masters. For either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Now, religious hypocrites in general, both in Jesus' day and in our day, are described as lovers of money. And one of the reasons why it's to be not present in elders is because religious charlatans can prey upon people and find a fat flock for the fleecing. That's the reality. And so as Christians, we have to be aware of, I'm having more trouble with my pen tonight than I can't even imagine. All right. We need to be aware of that as we are walking through in our churches, but also elders have to be careful of that as well. A second principle for battling greed, turn over to Proverbs chapter 30. Many of you may know and love this section here. I know Proverbs 31 is well known and often used as a hoping to be an encouragement, sometimes feeling like a cudgel for ladies at times. Proverbs 30. Look at verses 7 through 9. Two things I ask of you, do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. So letter B there would be seek God for what we need. Ask God for what we need. Ask Him for what we want too, but depend on Him for what we need. Principle for battling greed is looking to God to provide that which we need. We'll come back and look at this here in a moment, so we'll keep this open here. Moving on to the next important principle, letter C there, I have is maintain active contentment. And now I have that intentional word there, not just be content passively, but maintain active contentment. Without looking at the verses yet, when I use the phrase active contentment or intentional contentment, what things would correspond with actively being content? Actively expressing content. Showing contentment. What would that, not showing as in like, look at me, but as in like it being displayed, exuding from your actions. What would be connected to active contentment? Thankful. Okay. Generosity, thankfulness, prayer for what we need and to be content. Paul in Philippians chapter 4 said, I've learned to be content in all things. Again, he learned to be content. He had to go through having very little and being content with little. And he had to go through having an abundance at times and being content with that because, you know, the saying, I forget who, one of the kids was asking if something came up this few weeks ago, and the phrase, more money, more problems came up. How could that cause more problems? And the answer was, people might want to be your friend just because you have money. So there's never enough. So being content with more, which, quite frankly, is where most of us have to be. In the scope of history in general, we absolutely are those who are wealthy beyond belief. Pharaohs in Egypt and Caesars in Rome had less luxury than impoverished Americans do today. I mean, this is when we think about things. We have to be careful that we're not snobbish in our looking at life and history. Air conditioning, can you imagine how much of a blessing that would have been back in, well, Israel in the first century? Running water, plumbing. I was listening to several things recently, and I was reminded that plumbing, the actual like sewer systems that we have, is one of the most, if not the most important thing when it comes to healthcare and just general like societal advancement. We have an abundance of blessings that previous millennia, even hundreds of years ago, wouldn't have even dreamed about. So being content, we need to learn to be content with what we have. And we have an abundance. We don't have as much as that person, that's true. But we also have a lot more than those people, which is also true. Thanksgiving was one of the realities that really, when I think of active contentment, seeking the Lord for content, to be content, learning that, but also this active thanksgiving. Lord, thank you for what you've given to me. Because, as we're still looking in Proverbs chapter 30, look at verse 9. That I not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? The response to sometimes the blessing and the being satisfied can be, oh, who needs God? So, letter D is this: beware of lazy contentment. This kind of almost lethargic ambivalence and just revelry in the blessings. No, go ahead and put up the second slide here. Here's the statement number 2 that really gets at, I think, this lazy contentment. We'll look at a few verses here to close out. Contentment without thankfulness leads to pride and a forgetfulness of the God who has blessed you, and that is fertile soil for all manner of wickedness. This is not a summary of a verse, but really a summary of several sections and principles. I'm going to read for you Jeremiah. No, not Jeremiah. I'm going to read for you Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 10 to 13. This is in the promise of looking forward to the promised land. It says this: Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees, which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself, that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery. Or Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 7 and following says this: For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks and water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, and a land of olive oil and honey. A land where you will eat food without scarcity, in which you will not lack anything. A land whose stones are iron, and whose out of hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I'm commanding you today. Otherwise, when you have eaten and are satisfied and have built good houses and lived in them, And when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I'll just read one more section here from Hosea. Just read this morning. Chapter 13, verses 4 through 8. Yet I have been the Lord your God since the land of Egypt. And you were not known to any God except me, for there is no Savior besides me. I cared for you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. As they had their pasture, they became satisfied. And being satisfied, their heart became proud. Therefore they forgot me. So I will be like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I will lie in wait by the wayside. I will encounter them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and I will tear open their chests. There I will also devour them like a lioness, as a wild beast would tear them. God is talking about his judgment that came about because in the blessing, when they were full, when they were content, when they had all they could have desired, their affections went elsewhere. So just like we need to be careful and master that greed, which gives root to all sorts of trouble and sin, and that desire for more, for security, for provision, for all those things can birth all those wicked things like Judas, potentially. So can a lazy contentment foster this ambivalence toward and a disdain of God that leads to all manner of wickedness, which was the problem, first problem. Now, first is probably strong. The problem noted both in the warnings of God in Deuteronomy, as well as in the judgment passages in the minor prophets. You forgot God, and therefore the judgment is coming. So, greed and mastering greed is not just about make sure you don't have heart emojis every time you look at dollar bills. It's don't be watchful that you are not looking for security in your money and what it can buy for you, and that you don't look for the salving of your fears of what men might do or whatever might come by looking at your money. We're looking for somehow your ultimate deliverance is that next influx of money. But also, those of us, and all of us are those, who have a great amount of material blessings that we did not work for, that we were born into, particularly if you're born in the Western world, born in the United States, you have been blessed. You've won life's lottery in that regard. And any of the blessings that we have to be careful we don't have a lazy contentment that is characterized, I would say, by thanklessness over the many loving kindnesses of God, because then we become really despising of God who has blessed us with, and we despise in the gifts he's given to us. So be careful. Well, let me close in prayer tonight. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this study on greed and on the need to fight it and its many tentacles, the love of money, that can be a root of all sorts of evil. But Lord, may we be mindful of that lazy contentment that we can slip into if we are not careful, that also breeds a disdain for you or a taking for granted for those things that you have given to us, which in turn turns our hearts away from you to seek after other things. May we be content and thankful and always look to you for all of our needs and wants.